The bar was the kind of place that made Li Wei feel both comfortable and out of place at the same time. Dimly lit, with glossy wooden counters and smooth jazz filtering through the speakers, it had all the trappings of a high-end, high-status gathering. The walls were lined with old, weathered bookshelves, some of which Li Wei was certain had never been read, their titles far too esoteric to be practical. Every patron in the room looked like they had just stepped out of a business meeting that wasn't quite finished, but would probably end with someone getting an exotic drink with an even more exotic name. Li Wei didn't fit in. At 32, he was perpetually scruffy. His clothes were a mix of fast fashion knockoffs and vintage finds that didn't quite go together but somehow worked. A pair of round glasses perched awkwardly on his nose, and his hair, which had been meticulously styled this morning, now had that "I don't care" look about it, a few strands poking out like some indie rocker who had missed the latest trend. He took a long sip from his overpriced cocktail, something called the Shanghai Sunrise, and grimaced. It tasted like a fruity attempt at something sophisticated, and it was definitely not worth the price tag. But hey, he didn't have the luxury of being picky. He was just here to unwind, escape from the mess of his life. "I've got something for you," came a voice from behind. Li Wei turned and saw Xiao Hui, an old acquaintance he hadn't seen in years. Xiao Hui had always been the mysterious type, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone stop talking without saying a word. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, his hair perfectly slicked back, and his face a mask of calm confidence. If Li Wei had to describe him in one word, it would be enigmatic. "Really? Because I'm not in the mood for some weird conspiracy theory," Li Wei said, his voice flat. He could already tell this was going to be one of those nights. Xiao Hui smiled, but there was something unsettling about it, too smooth, too calculated. "I promise you, this isn't a theory. It's an opportunity." Li Wei raised an eyebrow. "Is it free?" "Of course not," Xiao Hui said with a wink. "But it's worth it. You'll see." Before Li Wei could protest, Xiao Hui led him through a narrow hallway at the back of the bar, toward an unmarked door that looked as if it had been there for decades. Inside was a long table, at least a dozen people sitting around it, all wearing black masks. No one said a word, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. The masks were perfectly featureless, no eye holes, no mouth, just plain, white surfaces that made it impossible to read anyone's expression. Li Wei stopped in his tracks. "What the hell is this?" "They're like us," Xiao Hui said, his voice oddly soothing. "Problem solvers. The nameless ones." Li Wei shot him a skeptical look. "So, what, you want me to join a secret society of mask-wearing weirdos?" "This isn't a Halloween party, Xiao Hui." Xiao Hui's smile didn't fade. "I understand you have your doubts. But what if I told you that I could help you fix everything? Your debts, your personal issues." Li Wei's gaze flicked to the faces around the table. "Okay. Let's say I'm listening. What's the catch?" Xiao Hui gestured to one of the masked figures, who stood and walked toward Li Wei. The person was tall, their presence commanding, though nothing about them gave away any clue to their real identity. The figure reached into their jacket and produced a small device. It looked like a remote control, but there was something unsettling about it, like it was too simple to be important. "Take this," Xiao Hui said. "It's for you. Use it to help us solve a crisis. And, you'll understand everything soon enough." Li Wei hesitated. "A crisis? What, like solving a murder or something?" "No," Xiao Hui said, his tone suddenly serious. "Something much bigger." Li Wei looked down at the device, then back at the silent figures around the table. He wasn't a sucker. He knew better than to get involved in things he didn't understand. But the chance to finally fix his problems? To make everything easier? His curiosity, and a deep-seated need to make things right, overcame his better judgment. "Fine," Li Wei said. "What do I have to do?" Xiao Hui's smile returned, but this time it felt less comforting. You'll need to trade places with someone. It all happened too fast. 1 minute, Li Wei was standing in the middle of a room full of masked figures, and the next, his world tilted. The device Xiao Hui handed him buzzed in his palm, and before he could even question what was happening, his entire body went numb, his surroundings warped. His sense of self fractured. He blinked rapidly, but when his eyes opened, nothing felt the same. His body, his hands, were unfamiliar. The sensation was like waking up in a stranger's skin. But it wasn't just physical, his mind was spinning, dizzying flashes of someone else's memories filling his head. Who was this? Where was he? Li Wei looked down at his new hands, which were sleek and well manicured, nothing like his own rough fingers. He was wearing a designer suit, dark and expensive looking. His reflection in the glass of the window across the room was that of a man he didn't recognize, a tall, older figure with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. His heart raced as he tried to grasp what had just happened. What the hell? A voice came from the other side of the room. "You're Xiao Yi now," said the person who had handed him the device. Their voice sounded familiar, but distorted through the haze of the body swap. "You have 48 hours. Complete the task we gave you, and you'll return to your old life." Li Wei, now in Xiao Yi's body, stumbled back in shock. His memories weren't his own. He had flashes of high-powered meetings, business deals, angry boardroom confrontations, but none of it was familiar. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. "Wait. What exactly am I supposed to do in this body?" he managed to ask, his voice, Xiao Yi's voice, sounding strange, cold. "Fix the problem with the corporation," Xiao Hui's voice called back. "The one we told you about. Your task is to uncover what they're really up to. We'll guide you." Li Wei's first instinct was to bolt. He wasn't equipped for whatever this was. He had no training in espionage, no experience in corporate warfare. But the task loomed over him like a dark cloud. And the more he tried to avoid it, the deeper he sank into the web of this bizarre conspiracy. Xiao Yi's office, his new office, was the epitome of corporate power. Glass walls that looked out onto the city, a sleek desk with multiple screens showing numbers, graphs, and messages he didn't understand. Li Wei, still reeling from the sudden shift, stood at the desk, staring at the cold, impersonal technology that now defined his life. He swallowed hard. "Okay. Focus. Let's see what you've got, Xiao Yi." His first discovery was a hidden folder on the computer, a series of encrypted documents. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a moment, the weight of his new identity pressed down on him. Who was this person he had become? A businessman, a manipulator, someone who controlled the fates of hundreds of employees and had his hands in shady dealings that didn't sit right with Li Wei. The documents contained evidence of illegal environmental practices, toxic waste dumping, yes, but it was worse than he had imagined. The corporation was involved in something far more sinister, the development of mind control technology, a project that had been concealed under layers of corporate jargon and public goodwill. The company wasn't just changing the environment, it was changing the minds of the people running the world. Li Wei's stomach twisted. This wasn't just corporate greed, it was a conspiracy to reshape global power itself. But the deeper he dug, the more he felt the weight of Xiao Yi's life seeping into him. Flashes of memories, his memories, started bleeding through, and Li Wei saw things that weren't his own. Moments of greed. Of power. Of manipulation. It was as if Xiao Yi's soul was trying to consume him. The next 24 hours were a blur, confrontations with executives, a fast-paced game of cat and mouse, trying to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy while simultaneously keeping up the facade of being Xiao Yi. But with every hour that passed, Li Wei felt his sense of self slipping further away. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He was fighting to stay himself. Li Wei, now trapped in Xiao Yi's body, stumbled through the labyrinth of corporate power, trying to make sense of everything that had been thrust upon him. Each hour felt like a different reality, his mind caught between the memories of his own life and those of Zhao Yi, the man whose identity he was now wearing. It was like living in someone else's skin, but with every moment, it became harder to separate where Zhao Yi ended and Li Wei began. His thoughts became blurred, his sense of self beginning to fade like fog in the morning sun. The documents he'd uncovered, encrypted files detailing toxic waste dumping, clandestine research into mind control, the covert plans to manipulate global leaders, were only the tip of the iceberg. But the more Li Wei dug, the more he realized that uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy meant stepping deeper into Zhao Yi's life, something that terrified him. It wasn't just the business deals or the dirty corporate secrets, it was the pull of Zhao Yi's mind, the overwhelming power he wielded, the cold, ruthless hunger that seemed to pulse beneath every decision that he could feel it now, the quiet undercurrent of power that had driven Zhao Yi's rise to the top. When he walked into a room, people stopped talking. When he made a decision, it was final. Zhao Yi's presence, his confidence, was intoxicating. And for a fleeting moment, Li Wei thought, maybe this is what I've been missing. Maybe this is what I've always wanted. But the thought was quickly snuffed out by a sudden pang of horror. He didn't want this. He didn't want to become someone else. He wanted to solve the problem, fix things, and get back to his own life. But as the hours passed, the line between who he was and who he was pretending to be grew thinner. The weight of Zhao Yi's life pressed down on him, suffocating him. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came late that afternoon. Li Wei, still in Zhao Yi's body, sat in a high-rise conference room, surrounded by executives who spoke in jargon so thick it felt like a foreign language. They discussed environmental compliance like it was a game of numbers, their voices clinical, detached, as if the lives they were ruining meant nothing. It was all about profit margins, bottom lines, and shareholder returns. Li Wei's stomach churned as he sat at the head of the table, forced to play the role of a man who had no conscience. The door to the conference room opened, and a woman stepped in, Ayun. She was in her 30s, dressed in a sharp red blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. The way she moved, the way she held herself, suggested authority. But when her eyes landed on Li Wei, something flickered in them, an unspoken recognition, like she knew him, or thought she did. Mr. Zhao, she said, her voice smooth, almost too polite. I have the latest reports on the waste site. I'd like to discuss them with you, if you have a moment. Li Wei's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who this woman was, but something about her made his skin prickle with unease. She seemed too familiar. Too real. He nodded, trying to slip into the role of Zhao Yi, even as a nagging sense of discomfort crawled under his skin. Of course, Ayun. Let's step into my office. She followed him into the plush office, the door clicking shut behind them. The space was sleek and minimalistic, with a few pieces of abstract art on the walls and a panoramic view of the city below. Li Wei sat at the desk, trying to look comfortable in the role of the arrogant businessman, but inside, he was scrambling. What's the update? He asked, trying to sound like Zhao Yi, though his voice didn't quite match his growing sense of panic. Ayun stepped closer, her face serious. There's been a breach. Someone has been asking questions about the waste sites. We've found traces of surveillance. Someone's been monitoring our operations from the outside. Li Wei froze. His heart hammered in his chest. Surveillance? Was it the Nameless Alliance? Had they already started watching him? Ayun continued, her voice low, barely above a whisper. I've been tracking the signals. Someone on the inside is leaking information, Zhao. It's only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down. Li Wei clenched his jaw. This was bad. Too bad. He had barely scratched the surface of the conspiracy, and now it seemed like someone had already begun to piece it all together. Find out who's responsible, he said, trying to sound detached. And make sure they're taken care of. Ayun's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp. Understood. But you should be careful, Mr. Zhao. You know how dangerous it can get when we start covering our tracks. The warning was clear, but Li Wei didn't need it. He could feel the danger creeping closer, like a storm on the horizon. He wasn't just caught in the middle of a corporate conspiracy anymore, he was part of it. The following days blurred into a chaotic series of meetings, phone calls, and backdoor deals. Li Wei, still trapped in Zhao Yi's skin, fought to hold on to himself as the man's memories continued to bleed into his consciousness. It was becoming harder to distinguish where Zhao Yi's thoughts ended and his own began. The more he wore this identity, the more it consumed him. He could feel Zhao Yi's mind pulling him in, whispering seductive promises of power and control. Every move he made was calculated, every word designed to manipulate, and yet, in the quiet moments, when he was alone, when his mind wasn't occupied by business scheming, he could feel the strain. He could feel the cracks in his own identity, the slow erosion of who he was. What would happen to him, to Li Wei, when the 48 hours were up? Would he even be able to go back to his old life? Or would he be lost forever, consumed by Zhao Yi's ruthless ambition? The deeper Li Wei went into Zhao Yi's life, the more disturbing things became. He uncovered a series of covert operations, illegal environmental practices hidden behind the facade of corporate responsibility. It wasn't just about toxic waste, it was about controlling the world, one covert action at a time. The technology they were developing wasn't just mind control, it was a way to bend entire populations to their will. It was when Li Wei found the lab files, hidden deep in Zhao Yi's private network, that the full scope of the operation hit him. The corporation wasn't just influencing governments, manipulating markets, or controlling minds, they were trying to build a new kind of society. A society where the masses were puppets, their strings pulled by the powerful few. Zhao Yi had been at the center of it all, pulling the strings in the background, a man who controlled more than just money and power, he controlled the very thoughts of the people around him. Li Wei couldn't breathe. He was drowning in the enormity of it all. And then, as if the weight of the conspiracy wasn't enough, came the final blow. He found the name of the person who had been leaking information to the outside, someone from the Nameless Alliance. Someone who had been watching him, waiting for him to crack the code. The betrayal stung, the realization that the very group he had reluctantly joined, had been forced into, was just as dangerous, just as corrupt as the corporation they were trying to expose. Li Wei looked at the name on the screen. The final piece of the puzzle. It was Xiao Hui. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Xiao Hui, the man who had brought him into this world, the one who had promised to help him, had been orchestrating everything from the start. He wasn't just a member of the Nameless Alliance. He was the leader. Li Wei's mind raced. He had been played from the beginning. The Nameless Alliance, the soul-swapping scheme, it was all part of the plan. Xiao Hui wasn't trying to help him, he was using him, just like the corporation had used Zhao Yi. The so-called global crisis wasn't about saving the world, it was about controlling it. The walls of Zhao Yi's office seemed to close in around him, suffocating him with the weight of the truth. He was trapped. In this body, in this life, in this twisted game. The only way out was to take down the people who had been pulling the strings from the start, and that meant confronting Xiao Hui. But what kind of man would he become after all this? Would he be able to reclaim his own identity, his own soul, or had he already lost himself completely? He didn't know, but he was going to find out. The realization hit Li Wei like a lightning bolt. Xiao Hui, his supposed ally, the man who had pulled him into this nightmare, was the true puppet master behind everything. The Nameless Alliance, the soul-swapping, the global crises, the dark secrets, it was all part of Xiao Hui's grand design. Li Wei had been nothing but a pawn in a game far larger than he could have ever imagined. As his mind spun, he tried to steady his breath. He couldn't afford to panic. Not yet. Not when everything was hanging by a thread. He needed answers, and the only person who could give them to him was Xiao Hui. The office around him seemed to warp, the once comforting panoramic view of the city now feeling like a cruel reminder of how small and insignificant he really was in this tangled web of lies. He turned from the desk, pacing the room as his mind raced. He needed to think, to plan, to figure out how to confront Xiao Hui. But the deeper he thought about it, the less certain he became. What if I can't go back? It wasn't just Xiao Yi's life that was slipping from his grasp, it was his own. His body, his thoughts, his very identity were becoming a blur, fading under the weight of this new, ruthless persona. He felt like a stranger in his own skin, and it terrified him. Xiao Yi's mind, his cold, calculating persona, was taking over. But then Li Wei thought of something else, something far darker. Xiao Hui. The man who had manipulated him into this situation, who had used him as a pawn in his own game. What if Xiao Hui was doing this to everyone in the Nameless Alliance? What if they were all just pieces on a chessboard, their identities erased and replaced with the souls of others to serve his goals? No. Li Wei shook his head. That was too much. Too far. But then again, what was the alternative? What if everything Xiao Hui had told him, the global crisis, the promises of salvation, had all been lies? What if he wasn't trying to save the world at all, but simply reshape it in his image? Li Wei needed to confront him. And the only way to do that was to take down the system that Xiao Hui had built, starting with the corporation at the center of it all. He didn't sleep that night. His mind wouldn't let him. The files, the documents, the hidden research, it all came rushing back. Li Wei had seen the full scope of what the corporation was doing, but what he hadn't known was just how far the manipulation went. There were entire departments dedicated to mind control, behavioral manipulation, the kind of technology that could turn entire populations into drones. It wasn't just about power or money, it was about control, about bending the will of the masses, making them think what the corporation wanted them to think, do what they wanted them to do. And now, with his access to Xiao Yi's identity, Li Wei could bring it all crashing down. At least, that's what he told himself. He wasn't sure he believed it. But he couldn't back down now. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had uncovered. The Nameless Alliance may have been complicit, but there was still hope, still a chance to fight back. If he couldn't trust the people who were supposed to be on his side, maybe he could still find a way to work from within. The next morning, Li Wei found himself in another meeting with Aiyun, the woman who had warned him about the surveillance breach. The same woman who had looked at him with suspicion the day before. She was standing in front of the desk when he entered the office, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed as she assessed him. Li Wei could feel her gaze, cold and calculating. He wasn't sure if she knew, but he had the distinct impression that she was watching him, testing him, trying to figure out if something had changed. "Mr. Zhao," Aiyun said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge. "We've got a problem. The breach you asked us to investigate, it's worse than we thought." Li Wei looked at her, trying to keep his expression neutral. "I need to stay focused," he thought. "I can't let her see I'm slipping." "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Aiyun hesitated, glancing at the door as if she were checking to see if anyone else was listening. "There's a mole in the organization, Mr. Zhao. And I think I know who it is." Li Wei felt a chill run down his spine. Was she talking about him? Had she somehow figured out that he wasn't really Zhao Yi? Or was it someone else? He kept his expression frozen, unwilling to let her see even a hint of his fear. "Who?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. Her eyes flickered with something like amusement. "It's Xiao Hui." Li Wei's breath caught in his throat. Xiao Hui? The leader of the Nameless Alliance? The one who had sent him here, who had forced him into this nightmare, Xiao Hui? Li Wei repeated, the words coming out more like a statement than a question. "What makes you think that?" Aiyun stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I've been following the money. The way the transfers work. Xiao Hui's been siphoning funds from the corporation, diverting them to his own projects. He's been using the Nameless Alliance as a cover. I think he's been playing both sides." Li Wei's mind was spinning. He had always known that Xiao Hui had his own agenda, but this was something different. Xiao Hui wasn't just manipulating him, he was manipulating everyone. But why? Li Wei asked, genuinely confused. What's he after? Ayun met his gaze directly, and for the first time, there was something like pity in her eyes. Power, of course. But more than that, he's trying to break the system entirely. He wants to remake the world, reshape it in his image. And he's willing to use any means necessary to do that. Even if it means using us all like pawns. Li Wei felt a surge of anger. He had been right. Xiao Hui hadn't just been using him, he had been using all of them, manipulating their lives, their identities, for his own twisted vision of the future. The Nameless Alliance was just as corrupt as the corporation they were supposed to be fighting against. How do you know all this? Li Wei asked. Ayun's eyes flickered briefly to the door again, then back to him. I've been investigating him. Watching him. I was one of his first recruits, back when he started the Alliance. But I didn't know how deep it went, how much power he was willing to wield. I thought we were working to change the world for the better. But the more I saw, the more I realized he was building something dark, something dangerous. Li Wei nodded, his fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't believe he'd fallen for it. He had trusted Xiao Hui, believed in the idea of the Nameless Alliance. But now, everything was clear. He had been nothing more than a pawn in Xiao Hui's game. What do we do now? Li Wei asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayun gave him a sharp look. We stop him. We bring down the corporation, the Alliance, everything he's built. But first, we need to get to him before he gets to us. Li Wei's heart pounded in his chest. He was on the verge of something monumental, an opportunity to take down the man who had manipulated him, the man who had orchestrated the whole damn thing. But at the same time, he was painfully aware of the cost. If he went through with this, there would be no going back. He would burn every bridge, sever every connection. But maybe that was exactly what he needed to do. You're with me? He asked, locking eyes with Ayun, her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Of course. We have to finish this. They spent the next hours gathering everything they could, documents, data, anything that would tie Xiao Hui to the web of lies he'd created. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that could end with them on the wrong side of everything. But they had no choice now. There was no going back. Li Wei knew that whatever happened next would change everything. His life, his identity, everything. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. As the night fell over the city, Li Wei felt a strange sense of resolve settle over him. He wasn't just fighting to reclaim his own identity anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been caught in Xiao Hui's web, everyone who had been deceived by the Nameless Alliance's twisted ideals. This time, it was his turn to pull the strings.